My parents kicked me out of the house because my sister got pregnant, and now they are homeless and want my forgiveness. Oleg had always known he was unwanted. Not in the obvious way. The way where people say it out loud, where they scream it at you in frustration, but in the quiet, insidious way that seeped into every corner of his life. His stepfather, Serhiy, never raised a hand against him, never directly insulted him, never threw him out. That would have been too simple. No, Serhiy had a far more effective way of making Oleg feel like an outsider in his own home. He ignored him. He acted as though Oleg were an uninvited guest who had overstayed his welcome, a stray dog hanging around the doorstep, tolerated but never embraced. Alina, on the other hand, was everything Oleg was not. She was adored, praised, and cherished. From an early age, it became clear that she could do no wrong in Serhiy's eyes. If she broke a plate, it was an accident. If Oleg did the same, it was carelessness. If she scored well in school, Serhiy showered her with gifts. If Oleg achieved something, his efforts were met with silence. Silence was worse than insults. It was the absence of acknowledgement, a void that grew deeper with every passing year. His mother, Irina, was the greatest disappointment of all. He had once believed she was on his side, that she would stand up for him, defend him when things became unbearable. But Irina lived in a world of make-believe, a world where everything was fine if she simply chose not to see the truth. Whenever Oleg tried to talk to her, whenever he told her that Serhiy treated him differently, she would just sigh and brush his hair back like he was still a small child. "You're imagining things," she would say. "Serhiy loves you both equally." But she knew. She had to know. And that was the part that hurt the most. Oleg's existence in that house was one of quiet endurance. He ate meals at the same table as them, but it never felt like he was part of the family. Conversations at dinner revolved around Alina, her achievements, her needs, her plans. If he spoke, his voice was drowned out, ignored, as though he were an unwanted background noise. On rare occasions when Serhiy did address him, it was with a clipped tone, a barely concealed irritation, as if speaking to Oleg was a chore he had no patience for. Then there were the humiliations. Small things, easy to overlook if one wasn't paying attention. Alina got the best room in the house, the one with the biggest window, the nicest furniture. Oleg's room was little more than a storage space that had been reluctantly cleared for him, cramped and dark. His clothes were always hand-me-downs from Alina's childhood, whatever sweaters or jackets were neutral enough that they could be passed to him once she had outgrown them. He never complained, because what was the point? If he so much as hinted at his dissatisfaction, Serhiy would scoff and say, "Be grateful you even have a roof over your head," and Irina would just look away. The difference in treatment wasn't just at home, it extended to everything. Alina always got new school supplies, the best books, the latest gadget. When Oleg needed something, the answer was always the same: use what you have. His stepfather had plenty of money, more than enough to give them both a decent life, but he never wasted a cent on Oleg if he could help it. School trips? Alina could go. Oleg had to stay home. After school activities? Alina was signed up for whatever she wanted, while Oleg had to make do with whatever cost the least. Even birthdays were a spectacle of favoritism. When Alina turned 16, Serhiy threw her a lavish party, complete with decorations, expensive gifts, and a cake so big it barely fit on the table. Oleg's birthdays were marked with a generic store-bought cake, placed in front of him without fanfare. No gifts, no celebrations. Just an obligatory nod in his direction before they moved on. The only true companion Oleg had was Mars, his one-eyed cat. Mars had been astray when Oleg found him as a child, hiding under the neighbor's porch, wounded and starving. He had begged to keep him, and for once, Irina had relented. Serhiy never liked the cat, claiming it was dirty, a nuisance. But Mars had been Oleg's only source of comfort, curling up next to him at night when the silence of his loneliness became too much. The cat was the only living thing in that house that didn't treat him like an outsider. But even Mars wasn't safe from Serhiy's pettiness. If the cat ever wandered too close to Serhiy, he would shove it away with his foot. If it scratched at the furniture, Serhiy would threaten to get rid of it. "You'll be out on the street with that filthy thing one day," he had muttered once. Oleg had clenched his fists, swallowing the anger, the helplessness. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. As Oleg grew older, the differences between him and Alina only became starker. She was treated like royalty, while he remained invisible. Alina got driving lessons, a car, the freedom to come and go as she pleased. Oleg? He was expected to take the bus or walk. Alina had money handed to her whenever she needed it. Oleg was told to find a job if he wanted anything. But the worst of it was the way Serhiy spoke about him when he thought Oleg couldn't hear. He had overheard it once. One careless comment, spoken too casually to be anything but the truth. "He's not really mine, sir," he had said to a friend on the phone, chuckling. "Irina insists we have to keep him, so what can I do?" And that was it. The confirmation of what he had always known. He wasn't wanted. He was tolerated. Nothing more. Oleg's childhood had been a masterclass in learning to endure. Learning to swallow his anger, to accept his place as an afterthought. He learned to expect nothing, to rely only on himself. And most importantly, he learned that in this house, he was not a son. Not a brother. Just someone they had to put up with. But Mars remained. The cat would curl up beside him every night, purring softly, as if to remind Oleg that he wasn't completely alone. That at least one living being in that house saw him. Acknowledged him. And sometimes that was the only thing that kept him going. Oleg had thought things couldn't get worse. He had spent years learning to exist quietly in the shadows of Alina's life, learning how to endure, how to expect nothing. But he had been wrong. There was always another way for them to remind him that he didn't belong. The announcement came over dinner. Alina, glowing with excitement, placed her hand on her stomach and declared, "I'm pregnant." Dimitro, her boyfriend, sat beside her, smirking like he had just won some great prize. Their mother, Irina, gasped before breaking into delighted laughter, rushing to embrace her daughter. "Sir," he grinned, slapping Dimitro on the back as if he had accomplished something grand. Oleg sat there, silent, invisible as always. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel. Happiness? No one had ever celebrated him like that. No one had ever looked at him with that kind of pride. His presence at the table was meaningless. He could have stood up and left right then, and no one would have cared. But then came the next blow. "We're moving back home," Alina said casually, as if it was already decided. "I'll need help with the baby, and we need somewhere stable for now." Oleg frowned, setting down his fork. The apartment Dimitro and Alina had shared wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. "Why not stay in your own place?" he asked before he could stop himself. Alina rolled her eyes, like the question itself was ridiculous. "It's too small. And expensive. Besides, this is family. And I'm having the first grandchild." The word stung, but nothing could have prepared Oleg for what came next. "You'll have to move out of your room," Irina said, barely looking at him. "They need the space." Oleg blinked. He had always known his place in this family was secondary, but this was a new level of cruelty. His room wasn't big, but it was his. The only space in the house where he could breathe, where he could have even the smallest illusion of control over his own life. "There's the guest room," he pointed out, forcing his voice to stay even. He already knew how this conversation would go, but some part of him, the part that still foolishly hoped for fairness, pushed him to speak. "No, sir," he said, shaking his head. "The guest room is for guests." Oleg stared at him in disbelief. "So what am I?" "Sir," he didn't hesitate. "You're legally an adult now, Oleg. You're not our responsibility anymore." The words landed like a slap. It wasn't just the decision, it was the ease with which they discarded him. Like he wasn't even worth pretending to care about. "But I still live here," Oleg said, his voice quieter now. He hated the way it trembled, hated that he even had to argue for something so basic. "You'll manage," Irina said briskly, already moving past the conversation. "It's just until they get on their feet." It wasn't. He knew that. Once he gave up his room, he wouldn't get it back. And it wasn't just about the room. It was the timing. His final exams were in a week. He had spent months preparing, hoping that maybe, just maybe, his grades would be his way out of this house, out of this life. But now, instead of studying, he would be packing up his things, moving into whatever tiny corner they decided was acceptable for him. "They can take my room after I'm done with exams," he tried again, his last attempt at some kind of compromise. Irina's gaze sharpened, and then she said the words that shattered whatever fragile hope Oleg had been clinging to. "We need to focus on the real grandchild now." It shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. He had always known how they saw him. Always known that he wasn't really part of this family, not in the way Alina was. But hearing it spoken out loud, so casually, so dismissively, it was different. It was final. "Sir," he shrugged. "If you don't like it, you can leave." And that was it. That was his choice. Give up the only space he had left, or be thrown out entirely. That night, Oleg sat on the floor of his room, staring at the walls, at the books he had stacked carefully on his desk, the notes he had spent months compiling. Mars, his one-eyed cat, curled up beside him, purring softly, oblivious to the storm raging inside Oleg's chest. The next morning, before he could even finish gathering his things, Alina and Dimitro started moving in. Boxes piled up in the hallway, their voices filled with excitement as they arranged their new space. No one waited for Oleg to be ready. No one cared. By evening, his old room had been transformed. Alina had decorated it with pastel colors, plans for the baby already in motion. Oleg, meanwhile, had been shoved into a corner of the living room with a thin mattress and a pile of his belongings. It wasn't just about space. It was about power. About reminding him, once again, that he had no say in anything. That night, as he lay on the makeshift bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the laughter from what used to be his room, he realized something. They had never planned for him to stay. They had been waiting for a reason to push him out. And now they had found one. The basement smelled of dust and damp concrete. It wasn't meant to be lived in, just a storage space where old furniture and forgotten things were left to rot. Now it was Oleg's new home. There had been no discussion, no attempt to make it more livable. One day, he had a bedroom, and the next, he was dragging his mattress down creaking stairs while Alina and Dmitro laughed upstairs, settling into what used to be his space. The basement was cold, even in summer. The single, small window near the ceiling barely let in any light. Oleg sat on the floor, staring at the pipes running along the ceiling, listening to the muffled voices of his family upstairs. He could hear Alina giggling, Dmitro's loud voice, the clatter of dishes. Above him, life went on. Below, he disappeared. At first, he told himself he could endure it. It was temporary. He just needed to finish his exams. But it didn't take long for his family to decide that if he was still under their roof, he needed to be useful. "You're living here for free, sir," he said over breakfast one morning, looking at him like he was a burden. "You should help out." Oleg clenched his jaw. He wanted to scream that he wasn't here by choice, that he had been shoved into a basement like an unwanted pet, that he had never once asked them for anything. But he knew better. Complaints would only lead to mockery, to Serhiy reminding him that he was an adult now, that they didn't owe him anything. "What do you need me to do?" Oleg asked, keeping his voice flat. Irina smiled, acting as if they were having a reasonable conversation instead of forcing him into unpaid labor. "The baby will be here soon. Alina will need help." Help. That was a lie. He already knew what they meant. Alina worked from home, sitting at her laptop all day, typing away while drinking overpriced smoothies. But somehow, she had decided that her job was far too demanding for her to take care of a child. And Dmitro? He was barely around. He had no problem making a baby, but raising one? That wasn't his concern. Which meant it would fall to Oleg. "I have exams," he said, though he already knew it wouldn't matter. Irina waved a hand dismissively. "You'll have time. It's just watching the baby now and then. Alina will still be here." That was another lie. The baby arrived in a flurry of excitement, filling the house with cries and sleepless nights. Oleg was barely given time to process it before Alina started treating him like a live-in nanny. It started with small things: watch her while I take a shower, hold her while I eat. Then, it escalated. "I have a meeting, just take her for a little bit." A little bit became an hour. Then 2. Then entire afternoons. He wasn't just helping. He was doing everything. Changing diapers, rocking the baby to sleep, holding her when she cried. He was up at all hours, exhaustion creeping in, his textbooks untouched. Every time he tried to say no, Serhiy reminded him, "You don't pay rent." Irina added, "Your family. Families help each other." And Alina? She didn't even pretend to be grateful. "Stop whining," she snapped one day when he hesitated to take the baby. "You're just sitting in that basement doing nothing anyway." The words hit harder than they should have. That was how they saw him. Not as a person, not even as a son or a brother. Just an extra set of hands. A convenience. Mars, at least, seemed to understand his misery. The cat never liked Alina. He avoided her, hissing when she tried to touch him. Oleg sometimes wondered if Mars could sense the rot in this family, the way things had always been stacked against him. Then, one afternoon, Mars delivered a message in the best way he could. Oleg had been in the kitchen, trying to grab something to eat before Alina called for him again. Then he heard the shriek. A real, rage-filled scream. He rushed into the living room to find Alina standing over her expensive designer bag, which was now covered in deep claw mark. Torn leather, shredded straps. Mars sat beside the ruined bag, tail flicking, eyes glowing with satisfaction. Alina turned, her face red with fury. "Your stupid cat did this." Oleg didn't say anything. He should have apologized. Should have tried to calm her down. But all he could do was stare at Mars, at the destruction, and feel something strange and unfamiliar rise in his chest. Satisfaction. For the first time in years, something had gone wrong for Alina. Of course, there were consequences. Serhiy raged. Irina scolded him like a child. Dmitro muttered about throwing Mars outside. But Oleg didn't care. because the message was clear now. It was time to leave. Oleg didn't pack much. There wasn't anything worth taking. A few clothes, his schoolbooks, things that had barely fit into the corner of the basement where he had been forced to live. He grabbed Mars and stuffed him into the worn-out carrier before anyone could try and stop him. Not that they would. No one even noticed when he left. Alina was too busy complaining about her ruined bag, Serhiy was watching TV, and Irina was rocking the baby, her attention completely focused on her real grandchild. Dmytro wasn't home, he rarely was. Oleg stood in the hallway for a second, waiting, almost expecting someone to call after him. But the house remained as it always was. Indifferent. He stepped outside and walked. Maxim had been his best friend since they were kids. He had seen everything, years of favoritism, years of Oleg being pushed aside like he didn't matter. But Maxim had never treated him that way. He had been the one person in Oleg's life who had never looked at him like he was a burden. By the time Oleg reached his house, his fingers were frozen, and his heart was racing. He had never asked for help before. It felt unnatural, almost shameful. But this time, he had no choice. Maxim opened the door, took one look at him and Mars, and didn't ask any questions. "Come inside." Oleg hesitated for only a second before stepping into the warmth. Natalia, Maxim's mother, was in the kitchen when they entered. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel, and immediately frowned. Did something happen? Oleg wasn't sure how to explain it. How did he put into words that his family had never really wanted him? That he had spent his whole life trying to be good enough for people who never saw him as anything more than an inconvenience? He didn't have to. Natalia took one look at him, at the way he was gripping Mars's carrier like it was the only thing keeping him grounded, and nodded. "You're staying here." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement. Oleg had no idea what to say. Maxim clapped him on the shoulder. "I already told Mom everything. She's been waiting for you to stop being stubborn and move in." Natalia sighed. "That house was never a home for you." Oleg swallowed hard. He didn't trust himself to speak. "Come on," Maxim said, nudging him forward. "Your room's ready." "My room." The words nearly knocked the breath out of him. It wasn't a basement. It wasn't a corner of the living room. It wasn't a space that could be taken away from him whenever someone decided they were more important. It was his. When they opened the door, Oleg didn't know what to do. It was a small room, but it had a bed, a desk, and a window that let in actual sunlight. The walls were painted a soft, warm color, not the cold gray of the basement. Mars leapt out of the carrier and immediately started exploring, rubbing his face against the furniture, claiming the space as his own. Oleg sat down on the bed, hands resting on his knees, and exhaled. It hit him all at once. For the first time in his life, he wasn't an afterthought. No one was waiting to remind him that he owed them for existing. No one was about to tell him to move, to sacrifice more of himself for people who never cared. He was safe. Natalia knocked on the door and poked her head in. "Dinner will be ready soon. I hope you're hungry." Oleg nodded. Maxim grinned. "You better be. Mom cooks enough to feed an army." Something tight in Oleg's chest loosened. He was home. The call came out of nowhere. Oleg almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and after everything he had been through, he wasn't in the mood for surprises. But something told him to pick up. "Hello? Oleg?" The voice on the other end was old but strong. There was something steady about it, something that made him sit up straighter. "My name is Andrei. I'm your grandfather." Oleg frowned. His grandfather? That wasn't possible. His mother had always told him that her parents had abandoned her when she was young, that she had been left to struggle on her own. I think you have the wrong person," Oleg said cautiously. "No," Andrei replied, his voice firm. "We've been looking for you for a long time." Oleg's grip on the phone tightened. Maxim, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, raised an eyebrow, silently asking what was wrong. Oleg shook his head, unable to explain. "We need to talk," Andrei continued. "There are things you don't know. Things your mother has hidden from you." Oleg hesitated. "What things?" There was a pause, and then Andrei sighed. "Everything." An hour later, Oleg sat frozen as his grandfather told him the truth. His mother had lied. About everything. She was never abandoned. In fact, her parents had always been there for her, had supported her in every way possible. They had given her money, helped her through school, even bought her a house. The house she lived in now. Oleg felt sick. That house. The one where he had spent years being treated like a stranger, the one where he had been forced into the basement and told he was lucky to have a roof over his head. That house belonged to his grandparents, and they had no idea what had been happening inside it. But that wasn't even the worst part. His stepfather, Serhiy, had a past of serious addiction. Gambling, alcohol, drugs. He had been in and out of trouble for years. Oleg's grandparents had tried to keep Irina away from him, had warned her over and over again that he was dangerous. She hadn't listened. And then came the final blow. Oleg, Andrei said, voice heavy. Your father, your real father, was a good man. Oleg's breath caught. We never wanted you to grow up without him. But Irina, she cheated on him. With Serhiy. Oleg felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His whole life, he had been led to believe that his father had abandoned them, that he was just some nameless man who never cared. But that had been a lie, too. He wanted to see you, Andrei continued, sorrow thick in his voice. But Irina wouldn't let him. She told him you weren't his. She refused to let us get involved. We tried, Oleg. We tried so many times. Oleg gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The past 20 years of his life unraveled before him, every painful moment suddenly making sense. He had never been unwanted by everyone. Only by her. Maxim, who had been silently listening to the conversation, reached out and squeezed Oleg's shoulder. Oleg barely felt it. His mother had stolen everything from him. His father, his family, his childhood. She had kept him trapped in a house that didn't even belong to her, forced him to live under the rule of a man who was nothing but a selfish addict. And the worst part? She had done it all without a shred of guilt. His grandparents had one final thing to say. Oleg, Andrei said softly, it's time to take back what's yours. Oleg had spent years being told he had nowhere else to go. That he had no one but them. That he was lucky they let him stay at all. Now, as he stood beside his grandparents, watching Irina, Serhiy, and Alina get thrown out of his house, he realized something. He had never needed them. It was a quiet afternoon when his grandparents arrived at the house, but the moment they stepped inside, the air changed. Andrei and his wife, Ol, carried themselves with the kind of authority that didn't require shouting. It was in the way they stood, in the way their eyes swept over the home they had paid for but hadn't set foot in for years. Irina greeted them with nervous enthusiasm, her voice overly sweet, as if she could charm her way out of whatever was coming. We weren't expecting you, she said, wiping her hands on a towel, the fake warmth in her tone almost laughable. I would have. We're here for Oleg, Andrei cut in coldly. Irina's smile faltered. Oh, Oleg? Well, of course. You know how teenagers are, so dramatic. This isn't your house, Irina. The room fell silent. Serhiy, who had been lounging on the couch like he owned the place, straightened slightly. Alina, who had been scrolling through her phone with a bored expression, finally looked up. What? Irina asked, her voice weaker now. Andrei's gaze hardened. This house belongs to us. We bought it. We allowed you to live here. But after everything we've learned about how you treated Oleg, that ends today. Oleg stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, waiting for the explosion. It came fast. Irina gasped, putting a hand to her chest like she had been personally attacked. You can't do this. This is our home. Andrei didn't flinch. Not anymore. Serhiy shot up from the couch, face red with anger. You can't just throw us out like we're nothing. You did that to Oleg for years, Ol said simply, her voice sharp as a knife. Consider this justice? Alina scoffed. This is ridiculous. Where are we supposed to go? Ol's lips curled in something that was almost a smile. Not our problem. Panic flickered in Irina's eyes, but she wasn't done yet. She turned to Oleg, desperation creeping into her voice. Olezenka, you won't let them do this to us, will you? We're family. Oleg met her gaze without a flicker of emotion. No, he said, voice steady. They're my family. The color drained from her face. You ungrateful brat? Serhiy spat, his voice shaking with rage. After everything we did for you. Everything? Oleg repeated, his voice sharp. You mean the years of treating me like a second-class citizen? Throwing me in the basement? Using me as free labor? Calling me a burden while living in a house that wasn't even yours? Serhiy opened his mouth, but no words came out. Irina tried again, her tone shifting into something more pitiful. I did my best for you, Olezenka. I sacrificed so much. You sacrificed me? She flinched. Andrei clapped his hands once, making them all jump. Enough. You have 1 hour to pack your things and leave. Alina looked like she wanted to scream, but instead, she grabbed her phone and stormed off to her room. Oleg already knew what was coming. She wouldn't accept defeat quietly. And he was right. Within hours, Alina had set up a GoFundMe titled Help a Struggling Mother and Baby After Heartless Eviction. She wrote a long, dramatic post about how she had been cruelly thrown out by her wealthy but cold-hearted family and begged for donations to support her and her newborn. At first, it worked. Strangers online flooded her with sympathy. She played the victim perfectly, until someone exposed her. Screenshots surfaced. Messages, old social media posts, even texts from Oleg that proved Alina had spent years treating him like garbage while living off their grandparents' generosity. The backlash was swift and brutal. People demanded refunds. The GoFundMe was shut down for fraud. Alina's last desperate attempt to manipulate her way out of consequences had failed. Serhij's downfall came next. His job, which had always been questionable at best, finally caught up to him. His company discovered shady business dealings. Bribes, fake transactions, money that had conveniently gone missing. The moment the investigation started, he was fired. And with his reputation already stained, no one was eager to hire him. Irina, once proud and comfortable, was now homeless with a disgraced husband, a daughter who had publicly humiliated herself, and a grandchild who cried endlessly in cheap motel rooms. The only one who seemed remotely relieved was Dmitro. He left them without hesitation, taking full custody of his child. Turns out, he had been miserable too. Once free from Alina and her toxic family, he flourished. He got a stable job, found a nice apartment, and raised his daughter in a healthy environment, something Oleg had never been given. Meanwhile, life changed for Oleg in ways he never imagined. With his grandparents now in control of the house, they set to work restoring it, not just structurally, but emotionally. The walls were repainted, warm and inviting instead of cold and lifeless. The old, suffocating atmosphere that had once made Oleg feel like a prisoner was gone. One room, in particular, was special. Since Mars was the first one to stand up for you, Ol said with a smile. He deserves a place of honor. And so, they built a dedicated cat area in the house, a paradise of scratching posts, soft beds, and climbing shelves. Mars, naturally, took his rightful place as king of the household, lounging in the sun like he had always belonged there. And for the first time in his life, Oleg felt it. He wasn't an unwanted guest. He wasn't a burden. He was home. With real family. With real love. And for the first time, he was truly, undeniably happy.